This Sunday is the last reading from the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is thought to be the earliest of the Synoptic Gospels and written to target the Roman believers, primarily Gentiles. I like the Gospel of Mark for two reasons. One, his succinctness, only 16 chapters long, and he emphasizes Jesus' actions much more than his teachings. In the beginning of Mark, we see a Jesus moving rapidly from one episode in his life to another. We follow him from Galilee through Judea and Perea. Along about chapter 11, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, goes to the temple, and begins a series of exchanges with the temple leaders. He says that the temple was going to wither away like a fig tree. He pronounces judgment on it and its leaders because they had turned it into a den of robbers. He contrasts the small faith of its leaders with the great faith of the widow who gave everything she had to God. Mark makes it clear that Jesus went to the temple to replace it and its leaders. It must be brought down and replaced with a new building, a new place where people can meet God with new leadership. Jesus is the vessel through which God is going to build a new house where his presence will live. Here at the beginning of Mark 13, we find a fully apocalyptic Jesus who predicts the destruction of the temple and later the demise of the religious and political status quo, and eventually his own death in the midst of unrest. This chapter is important because it's the bridge connecting Jesus' public ministry to his death. This is the last sermon Jesus gives his disciples in Mark before he dies. And he wants to make some things clear about his return before he's killed. The scene of this gospel story takes place near the temple. Some of the disciples are impressed with the new temple that Herod the Great started to build. It was larger than any previous temple and certainly one of the most impressive structures in Jerusalem. But the temple was more than simply a beautiful building. The temple was a sign of God's presence with Israel. The temple was Israel's connection point with God and a symbol as their identity of God's people. Jesus literally left the temple, but these words also symbolized his definitive break from the temple and all it represented for the Jewish people. Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, leaves the center of Jewish faith and life, never to return. Jesus did not come to uphold Jewish buildings and institutions. He came to create a new way of belonging in the world for the betterment of God's people. He left the temple because he rejected its corrupt practices and its leadership. Then, in the private presence of his disciples, Jesus tells them that this beautiful temple is going to be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. The disciples, faced with and fearing the unknown, ask Jesus, when? But notice Jesus does not answer the disciples' questions about when change will come and chaos will ensue, but instead tells them the how and why. Nation will rise against nation and kingdoms will fall. Jesus tells them to watch out, pay attention, and be alert. Certainly knowing the severity and destination of future superstorms will help save lives, but the disciples were longing for more. They wanted a blueprint. Perhaps they hoped for a way to save themselves as they interpreted the signs of the time. But Jesus was not giving them an inside track on knowing the future. He was telling them they didn't need to know the future, just the one who holds the future in his hands. Jesus wanted his disciples to focus on being faithful in the present, not predicting the future. So where's the bridge for us between Jesus' words for the disciples 2,000 years ago and our own uncertain future? Like the disciples, something makes us want to know every detail about when and how and why our future and God's ultimate justice will take place. Jesus' main purpose in the Olivet Discourse isn't to give us a timeline of future events, but to call us into present faithfulness. We live in a broken and sin-filled world. As Christians, we are challenged to live as people of faith in such a world. Well, what does this look like? Today's gospel gives us a glimpse of life in a broken world. We are told the future will be filled with trials and tribulations, just like our present is and our past was. Jesus says these things are but the beginning of birth pains. Women anticipate birth both fearfully and joyfully, fearing the pain but looking forward to the baby. As the time approaches, the mood is more joy than fear, more hope than despair. When a woman goes into labor, it means that a birth is about to take place. But no one really knows how long those labor pains will last. The birth pains mean that the birthing process has begun, but they don't tell us exactly when that child will be born. Even at labor's peak, pain does not completely eliminate joy or hope. After the birth, painful memories dissipate, and the mother is left with nothing but joy. In the midst of our own troubles and personal crisis, Jesus' point for us is that we must live lives of readiness and expectation. We can't predict when crisis will happen or how long we must endure the pain. But we know that God will be the one to hold our hand, dry our tears, and stand beside us through the storm. Therefore, it seems these apocalyptic words of Jesus were meant to bring us a message of hope for all of us. Yes, change can be painful and fearful, be radical and disruptive to the status quo. But just like Jesus walking out of that temple and predicting its collapse, we need to work to build new structures where people can meet God here and now. And the structures that need to collapse aren't necessarily physical ones, but the stones and walls that keep individuals in transgender faith in which ultimately, despite our present struggle, God's love is sovereign. We are called to manage our lives and conform them to God's vision of justice, kindness, compassion, love, and peace. The faithful response to disaster is not pointing a finger or making shocking, headline-grabbing accusations, but service to God and our neighbors. Faith does not believe that God will make our lives comfortable and affluent. Faith knows that whatever the situations we face, God will walk with us to the end. Faith is not worrying about the future. Faith is being concerned about the needs of others today. Faith is not longing for heaven when we die. Faith is being in communion with others, serving, loving, supporting, welcoming one another, and sharing in God's blessings. Brothers and sisters, being human can be messy, painful, fearful, and troublesome. People may deceive us, encourage us with false hope, and attempt to control us with their lies. But we know the end of Jesus' apocalyptic message. Amidst the change and chaos of life, God is our constant. God gives us hope, love, and his grace. And God places others to help guide us through our own birth pains. Just like that mother in labor who has a coach to encourage her, to rub her back, to wipe her tears, to wipe her sweat, we are given our own earthly companions to travel an uncertain future alongside us. Be watchful for the grace and blessings of God. God is still creating, still planning, and holding open the future. Like many Christians in hard times, I have found myself considering Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." It's reassuring in the midst of troubles to know that God has a plan for us and that it's a good one. Be mindful in the present because we never know when, where, or in whom God will decide to show up. Amen.